Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today I'm talking with Neel, communist geographer located in the Pacific Northwest, author of Hinterland and Field Notes. And today we're talking about the state of the global working class, particularly in relationship to massive changes of investment and industrial and deindustrialization, focusing, I believe, on like Tanzania and in China. And so you've written a lot about premature deindustrialization recently and its effects on the global working class. And you've had to do, like geographic work in East Africa and in China to do so. What are the concerning trends on deindustrialization right now?
Well, the big overarching trend, and if you've read Aaron Benenev's book, Automation, the Future of Work, also Jason Smith's book, Smart Machines and Service Work or something like that, they both also talk about this in kind of slightly different terms. But Aaron is particularly good at framing it as this kind of long run trend, where when you look at these developmental bursts, right, a developmental burst always includes industrialization and is almost always driven by industrialization. There's a few cases where that is not true, and those are unique, and I can talk about those if you'd like. But the core of it is always some sort of kind of industrial employment growth, driving productivity growth, which drives output growth, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this particular relation between all of those measures that Aaron discusses in more detail. But the overarching pattern is that this period of rapid industrial growth, this big, economic miracle period that is usually how it's referred to, has been getting shorter and shorter over time in each of its different iterations, and has also been employing a smaller and smaller relative share of the population. So even if you look at the big one, right, which was China, it actually has already peaked. It peaked several years ago, and has employment in manufacturing has been declining since then. It ticked up slightly, I think, after the pandemic, and then has been coming back down. And it never even reached the level of employment as a share, manufacturing as a share of total employment in kind of the classic examples from the US in like the 1930s or the UK, a little bit earlier than that. So that's the big overarching kind of pattern, is that as these booms have happened, they've gotten kind of smaller and smaller. The other thing that's really important is that they've also become more and more geographically limited. And so that's something that I focus on a lot more, is this idea of those industrial territories.
Mm-hmm.
We can produce more. Think about it as, often we talk about being able to produce more goods per worker, right? So the worker's productivity kind of increases, but there's something else that happens. There's a spatial productivity that also increases. We can pump more goods out of a given location, right? These industrial territories, than we could in the past. And what that means is that industrial production actually concentrates even more over time. And so you get what some industrial geographers and economic geographers have called like a spiky world, where there's this intense concentration of economic activity in particular areas, both in manufacturing and extraction, all kinds of things. This converts areas into what some other urban geographers call technical lands or technical territories, where they're kind of territories given over exclusively to these like extractive functions, or all of this is also what I talk about in the context of the hinterland, as like sacrifice zones, which are much more broad, because they're not necessarily specialized. They're the leftover of the concentration of economic activity in these areas. So what happens, what follows from that increasing kind of concentration and these changes in you don't need as many employees, et cetera, is also that you get this intense overproduction and it's often called overproduction over competition, because you have basically industrial overcapacity in a lot of sectors. And overcapacity just means that you're producing like this insane amount that the market can't quite clear all of the time. And the classic examples of this are like steel sectors, and that drives profitability really low. Overcapacity does. People often attribute like low profitability in Chinese steel sectors to the fact that one of the big producers is state owned, but that's not at all true. It's all low profitability is true across the board, private or state owned, and state owned aren't really state owned in the way that people think they are, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea is that it drives profitability down across these industrial sectors. This is something that Robert Brenner talks about a lot, and that creates an increasingly zero-sum battle in international markets for manufacturers over who's going to be able to fill those orders and win the few places, kind of win the employment and the contracts for the few places that do get those industrial booms. So the big patterns over time are basically the peak is higher, it's shorter, and fewer countries have the opportunity to do the traditional kind of Listian style developmental boom, where you're kind of using tariffs and you're using kind of national support in order to cultivate domestic industry, and then you enter into the global market on that basis.
Which makes 60 styles developmentalism much, much harder to even pretend to be a viable option.
Yeah, and not just 60s style. Like, it's this developmental thing is much older than that.
Mm-hmm.
Like it goes all the way back. I'm working on a book project right now, and one of the chapters is kind of like this quick and dirty history of global development, right? And we could trace it back to how the British escaped and overcame Dutch hegemony and stuff. But I think in terms of like real recognizable like machinofacturing, like industrial world, the first case of like a developmental state as we think of it today is actually the US, right? It's the Hamiltonian project. It's very, very clear that's the core of this new school of like political economy that was forming in Pennsylvania. And Hamilton and that Hamiltonian scene was deeply influential on subsequent developmentalist states in Germany, in France, in Japan. Saint-Simon, the utopian socialist, he fought with Hamilton in the Battle of Yorktown, and then was deeply influenced by that whole social circle, and then went on to propound similar things in France, focusing on these large developmental mega projects like the Suez Canal. And in addition to that, Frederick List is the big figure in kind of developmentalism. And if you read List's book, The National System of Economy or something like that, he has this whole, he does historical case studies. That's why he's really interesting compared to classical political economists, because he does a lot of historical case study. But his big, like, effusive one is on the US. And he's just like, look at all these great, amazing things that the US has been able to do because it pursued these more protectionist policies and fostered local industry. And I think people also forget that this was a really, really bloody and like no holds barred kind of industrial competition. I mean, it involved piracy, industrial espionage, literally people going like undercover to tour British factories and then coming back and founding the same type of factories in Massachusetts, right? Mm-hmm. Britain tried to ban the export of technology and of any technicians. So if you were a skilled artisan, you couldn't migrate. And then on top of that, and this is the funniest part, is the US patent system, which is now the base for the world patent system, was essentially just a form of legalized theft, where you could come to the US and patent something that was already patented in the UK, and then the patent wouldn't be recognized from the UK, or the intellectual property rights wouldn't be recognized. And then that would establish kind of the legal authority for the patent. So that attracted a bunch of other skilled engineers and whatnot, so that they could patent their ideas. So, it's very, very similar to the types of things that happen during later developmental state attempts, and just kind of repeats itself over history. But the change, right, is that like fewer and fewer and smaller portions of the global population are able to like do this.
So, I mean, the geographic element of it, I've never thought about. The technological element of it has quite interested me. I mean, even from like a very, very like staid classical Marxist perspective, the amount of automation is going to reduce socially necessary labor time dramatically. So you just need less labor to do stuff. And that's going to, it doesn't ever hit rock bottom, as like Benenev actually says. Like the fully automated world is not really possible, at least not without machinery that is effectively as sentient as human beings are. But it does seem like this concentrates things. So now you're doing these developmental programs. The interstate competition is going to be huge. Now, to me, that actually really does have some pretty big effects on what various kinds of lefts are arguing you can do in the developing world, right? I mean, there's a modern monetary view that if you pump currency into it, it'll come. But the trends that I'm seeing from your work indicates that might not be the case. So
Yeah, well, in the modern monetary theory people, they're interesting. I talk about them in my dissertation a bit. I have a segment on them. A lot of what they write is kind of this two-faced thing, where a lot of times they're talking about things that like the US can do, and they sort of pretend like other countries can do them as well, but they don't actually make that case, right? They make the case with like the US, and then when you think about it, there's two major kind of issues with their fundamental arguments. The one issue is that when you dig into what they're saying, they actually do always admit that there is a hard limit to this spending, right? And the hard limit is not inflation itself. Inflation is the symptom of this hard limit for them, or it's one of the symptoms. But if you read like what the MMT people wrote about Zimbabwe, for example, where there's this massive inflationary wave, they basically make this argument that look, the spending wasn't necessarily causing inflation on its own. It's that like this spending was running up against kind of these, the actual productive capacity of the economy. They always go back to this sort of idea that like, well, no, there's an actual kind of capacity of the economy that's embedded in what can actually be done with that, like level of technology, the amount of wealth concentrated there, et cetera, really negative results such as hyperinflation. And so that's an interesting point, because that completely like blows all of these schemes out of the water for poor countries, right? Basically, they're saying like, no, there are these hard limits for poor countries. You can't just use even if you have a sovereign currency, you can't just use the treasury to kind of pump money through spending. Because you have these hard limits. But then again, we think, well, what are these hard limits? Where are they coming from? Well, that's just the global structure of kind of imperial inequity, right? Like, so we're coming back to these same problems, so they're just not really dealing with it. Now, the second problem that they have is that even in their case study of the US, right, they are being a little bit dishonest in this classical political economy fashion of pretending like countries exist in this really strong sense, right? Because the US isn't just a country, right? Especially the US. And the U.S. Treasury is not just producing a national currency. The U.S. Treasury is producing the global currency, right? The dollar. So so many of the things that they point out are possible for the U.S. are actually possible, but they're possible because the U.S. has this massive imperial seigniorage right through its control over the U.S. dollar. So what would happen if we pursued some of those policies? Maybe there would be some domestic inflation, but I think there are arguments about why that wouldn't happen, or pretty good. I think that the inflation that is happening for somewhat different reasons, et cetera, et cetera. But what would really happen if we went all out and started kind of pumping cash through the treasury to do spending programs? Well, it's fairly obvious. That would just initiate massive turmoil in these international exchange markets. And when you look at different things like these trade war patterns that have kind of cropped up again and again over the past 50 years, Brenner focuses on this a lot. Those currency exchange rates become like the central thing eventually, because that's how you make manufacturing competitive in this kind of zero-sum competition. One of the easiest ways to make manufacturing competitive is to devalue a currency relative to the US dollar.
Yeah. I remember my first arguments with the MMT people were when I was living in Egypt during a hyperinflation crisis. So, for floating the currency. So that's this. It's interesting though. you hear a lot about China as if it's an industrial miracle. I mean, it's died off recently because Chinese GDP is like 5%, which is not bad compared to the West, but is bad for China. Um, and doesn't really look to have many ways to recuperate anytime in the near future. Um, Now, GDP is not necessarily always the best way to judge an economy. I admit that, but it does seem like the leapfrogging pattern of industrial development in China is plateauing in a pretty severe way post COVID. How is that likely to affect international development?
Yeah, well, so I would say the COVID basically just made clear what had already happened.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these trends actually peak in like the mid 2010s, essentially.
Okay.
So if we're looking at like Chinese outbound investment, Chinese growth in the share of employment in industry, if we're looking at things like factory closures, relocations, et cetera, they have this sort of ghost tail that gets carried forward because of the real estate and infrastructure bubble. But a lot of the core trends actually peaked quite a bit earlier, and service employment started to tick up at the same time. So in one sense, all that's happening is in China is what has happened everywhere else, which is just that you're going to see a bunch more employment in services, slowing growth, and that growth will continue to slow, although there may be upticks. In China has a lot more of a potential to have stronger upticks in growth over the next 2 decades than like Japan did. I think people always don't quite have a grasp on exactly how big China is and how much it still includes these kind of large segments of cheaper labor population, and then also areas just for like physical kind of development and huge market kind of potential. Like it's a little bit more similar to like how the US was back in like the 19th century, where there was still like a lot of potential, even during like the slow growth of like the 1870s or whatever, the first Great Depression, right? The US had this massive domestic market potential because of just like its size and expansion and all of that stuff. It's gonna be more muted today, but I think that there's still a lot more of that potential than we often kind of think when we see these kind of declining growth measures. Now, at the same time, what's really kind of going to happen worldwide is, first, there is going to be a lot more demand for new sources, new sites for cheap labor, and that's kind of a global problem right now. And that's actually one of the major reasons behind this inflationary kind of burst, is that we're hitting certain limits in the supply of cheap labor without having fully developed any sort of like alternative to it. Now there's some, Vietnam is the big one, right? But Vietnam is really small, like compared to China. So there's this big new industrial burst in Vietnam, and it's basically just like an extension of these South China Sea industrial complexes just going down to the Red River Delta. They're very close geographically. That's really important for industrial supply chains. And then culturally, and it's very close to the Chinese border and all of that stuff. But like I said, Vietnam is pretty small. The big ones that you're looking at right now are going to be Indonesia and India, Pakistan as well. Those are the big areas where we're seeing kind of bursts of industrialization, especially in the core sectors, and then also they all have relatively large populations. But even there, the population really isn't that big compared to the original Chinese input of kind of cheap labor into the global economy. So this is kind of like a very long run issue as well, is that when you start to look out further, the only place that's going to have very large pools of labor in the next 100 years is going to be Africa. So that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of focus on, looking at kind of these developmental trends in Africa, and the idea of like, is Ethiopia that sort of developmental state? And there are cases in Africa, like the Ethiopian example, of trying to emulate that traditional kind of developmental state model. And that's really the direction that a lot of those kind of left-wing developmentalist things from the 60s, right, that were like kind of rebel development kind of things, they all sort of boiled down eventually to this one program that was formulated in In the Chinese case, it was Shui Muqiao, who's the guy who basically created like the socialism with Chinese characteristics, more or less, or like market socialism idea in China. He essentially wrote the book on it. And then Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia. I think people forget that like the initial developmental state in Ethiopia was like they were the last anti-revisionists too.
Right.
They had like jumped from it was Soviet like classical Stalinism, and then it was support for China, and then it was support for Albania, and then they were kind of on their own. But the program was essentially got boiled down to the same thing of just this classic Listian model of you need state protection, and then that will serve, and then it's got this kind of like new element of serving export markets. So it's kind of like this updated kind of Listianism for like globalization, right? Where you do protectionist stuff in order to be competitive on the global market, and then you enter selectively into certain product lines early on for export production. You use export earnings to then fund further developmental things. The problem is that this is people trying to emulate this Chinese example. Or the Taiwanese example before it, or you could argue South Korea and Japan and stuff, but especially mainland China, because it didn't have as much explicit military support from the U.S. But what it did have is this very long period of basically like autarkic industrial development, the development of immensely literate and healthy population, right, during the socialist period. And this massive amount of embedded kind of like technical knowledge that was just already there. So people think that China was just like a source of cheap labor, but that wasn't at all true. It was a source of highly skilled cheap labor for low-level industrial production. That is something that basically nowhere else in the world has right now. So I think that's the other kind of big hurdle is you're not just looking for cheap labor, you're looking for this particular type of population and these kind of unpaid amenities of like the socialist era that the global capitalist economy benefited from in the Chinese case are like not present anywhere else. So, that's going to be, I think, an even bigger problem.
Yeah, there's not a ton of highly educated peasants in Bangladesh, This does. I mean, this raises some interesting questions. I mean, one is that, implicit in what you're saying, I just want to like draw it out a little bit, that Leninist style developmental modelings was basically the American model against what America was selling, which was not not what America actually did. Correct? But that's basically.
I more or less, but the Leninist thing is, I think it's very distinct in and of itself, and it's not even something that we would maybe call Leninist at a certain point. It became really enshrined under Stalin as this particular style of hyper Taylorist developmentalism. I think it was more this in Lenin. There's this line that Mario Tronti says, like, what was a tactic in Lenin becomes a strategy in Stalin, and I think that's a good way to understand it. Of like this, what was being pursued as kind of this last ditch tactical retreat under Lenin become in the like new economic program, and then also in some of these elements of idealizing certain forms of American industrial organization. These things become kind of strategic elements of like Stalinist industrialization, especially that Taylorist kind of aspect to it. But there's this long history basically in leftist thought, right? We have like Marx, and we have Marxian kind of socialism and all of that. But Marx at the time is also writing against all these like Ricardian socialists, and then later these people like Lassalle who are essentially Listian socialists, right? And that revives itself again and again. These other non-Marxist kind of socialisms, non-communist forms of socialism, basically is how I would phrase it. And those things then get called Marxism later. So that's the very confusing part, is that these Listian socialisms about like national development, right, they then become the thing that many people think of as like quote unquote Marxist orthodoxy, that gets sort of enshrined in this Stalinist period for some of these reasons. But I would actually say, so here's the funny thing though, I would actually say that the people, if the third world kind of developmentalists really want a program that would work better, the Stalinist program would actually work way better, because it's much more hardcore about going for that all-out industrialization in an autarkic fashion early on, which then is what enables, like in the Chinese case, right, that gives you that basis to then be attractive to the global market when it kind of starts to break down and ossify, which isn't like a good plan, right? But it's kind of this ironic thing where the plan that's actually pursued now is worse, because it doesn't include this intensive period of hyper industrial development that then gives people like technical skills and mass literacy and good healthcare and all of these things that then become attractive amenities when the market doesn't have to pay for them later, when that system starts to kind of break down, and you can just you can go in and discipline this massive potential proletariat population, right? And if you look at some of the older examples of some of the third world, like third worldist stuff from like Samir Amin and stuff, their earlier versions of what they called delinking were more that.
Right.
They were more this classical Stalinist developmentalism. But then later they become like, oh, look at what China's doing. Like this weird argument about like export production is somehow delinking because it gives like domestic industries more power, which is kind of true, but like it's really not delinking,
Well, that always seemed to me to be the long socialist habit of making a virtue out of whatever necessity was at hand.
Yeah.
Which because one of the things with the Stalinist developmental paradigm is you do actually still need a lot of raw materials within your zone to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't know if Africa is mineral rich, but I'm not sure that that any one country can do that kind of developmentalism anymore. I don't know.
Well, no one is advocating that anymore is the other thing. Even the what we would think of as like the Stalinist parties that exist there, like the Communist Party of Kenya. There's several others. There's the one in Eswatini and some other places. These parties actually just look at China now, and so they basically have like the Zinawian model, which is from Ethiopia, like this idea of emulating something like the Chinese example, but the Chinese example starting in like the 70s. So they're basically like not really. It's this kind of weird thing where the people that everyone calls Stalinists now are like not Stalinists, they're Dungists, but like, or
right.
Everyone calls them Dungists. Really, I think the more accurate thing would be like Shui Muqiao. But the idea is that you can do this kind of like export production, but then they're also skipping that whole early stage, which if you look at like Shui Muqiao, he basically acknowledges that's actually a very important stage. But skipping that kind of early stage makes it even weaker. It's not that it's not possible, but you get something more like Ethiopia is today, which is not a very successful developmental state, right? Because, and here's the interesting thing about Ethiopia is that if you were just looking at cheap labor, right? Because this is how it often gets talked about, the spatial fix and all that, going to find new sources of cheap labor. If you were just looking for cheap labor, Ethiopia should have attracted far more FDI than it has. It's attracted a decent little amount, but Ethiopia is some of like the cheapest labor sources in the world. It's got a massive population. It's much cheaper than even like the rest of East Africa. And it's been basically kind of like middling results. Like it has had some developmental kind of success, but much, much less than like the sort of boom that you saw in the coastal regions in China. And again, it's because you're not actually just looking for cheap labor, period. You're looking for this kind of like cheap skill, like labor with amenities, essentially.
Oh.
And proximity.
Yeah. So what does this mean for the development of Africa exactly? Like what can we expect there? Are we expecting a more precarious workforce, more sacrifice zones than even in the developed world? What are we looking at?
Well, I think what you're seeing right now is you could almost call it like a Indianization of Africa in some ways, where there's sort of the type of depeasantization and de-agrarianization that occurred in India starting in like the Green Revolution, right? Where you still have a lot of people who live in the countryside, but those people, and they're farmers, right? But the actual amount of land that they farm on is not even enough for subsistence. So they're essentially all market dependent farmers, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're no longer peasants in this traditional sense because of that. But there aren't big employment centers in the cities, or the employment centers in the cities aren't stable enough, right? The cities themselves are going to get very large for different reasons. There is right now, well, let me back up. In Tanzania, so one of the demographic kind of trends in most sub-Saharan African cities has been driven, like urban growth has been driven by demographic increase for a long time, since essentially like the collapse, right? Since the third world debt crisis, and the collapse of African industries that attended it. What that means is that a lot of the population growth in cities just come from people like having kids, essentially. There hasn't been a lot of migration to the cities that's been sustained, or it's been balanced by out migration from the cities in that period. Now, starting in the year 2000-ish and onward, a few urban cores in sub-Saharan Africa have started to see much more traditional styles of like migration-driven urban growth. So Dar es Salaam, where I did my field work in Tanzania, is one of these centers. So if you look at all of the cities in Tanzania, Dar es Salaam has been like basically the most astounding kind of growth in East Africa. Is set to become, one of the biggest cities in the world, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, it's been driven by migration, and other cities have had this more classical demographic pattern where they've just been growing by demographic increase, or losing population, or not growing that fast, et cetera, et cetera. But Dar es Salaam has been growing very, very rapidly. So you have all this migration, but you don't have an industrial core to sop it up, right? So people end up in basically just what's called like the vast informal sector. And it's very notable that the informal sector, the idea of the informal sector, basically comes from Kenya in East Africa, and the initial studies of it in like this widespread fashion, right, were often conducted in India, because that was the other big kind of example. So it's a lot of people get employed in really low end sort of craft work, a lot of amorphous services, these very precarious kind of jobs that are in circulation sectors, or in like really dangerous forms of kind of like processing. A lot of them might serve a domestic demand, like the wood product sector in Tanzania is a good case of that, where people are just kind of like hand make furniture. But then that also kind of gets has this weird interaction with like Chinese made furniture, for example. And so there's this it's not that there's no manufacturing involved in it. It's just that the manufacturing is often of like a handicraft nature still, but it's plugged into markets. So it's not subsistence handicrafts anymore. And it's not super local markets. It's like these weird domestic markets that are somewhat larger. They exist in interaction with these large kind of manufacturers, in the sense that like some new form of chair will come out of a Chinese factory, and then these local handicrafts people will try to like figure out how to make something sort of like it out of local wood products, So there's markets like that kind of evolve. But basically the problem that you have is you have this massive proletarianization going on, but you don't have this industrialization underneath it. So that's really the core issue that I'm talking about with premature deindustrialization, is this employment problem of that you basically have a massive portion of the population just employing these hyper precarious sectors that are sort of services or handicrafts or hard to define informal economy things. And this is a condition, a general condition of deindustrialization, but in poor countries is particularly brutal because you don't have like this massive amount of wealth sloshing around to fund like bullshit NGO jobs, basically, which is what happens in the wealthy countries when you have the same sort of problem. There's still wealth going around to trickle down to have to give someone their stupid little office job that really kind of does nothing, you know, but there's enough money to kind of pay for it. Or, you know, like American construction industry is kind of like that too, like this massive wastage of money, horribly unproductive, tons of like contractors and middlemen, huge bureaucracy, that sort of thing. But in poorer countries, you can't really, you know, you still have many of those same industries, like you still have, you know, a lot of people employed in construction for, and it's very, very hard work and very brutal in those conditions. But then it's also, you know, these weird, very, very marginal sort of forms of subsistence, market-based subsistence that are different.
So one thing I think reading your paper, which I'm going to link in the show notes, Broken Circle, that makes this period kind of interesting, is trying to parse out like critical development theories and dependency theories versus what premature industrialization actually is. Now, you've already set up the framework for that a little bit in explaining this, but can you talk about the differences and maybe like Zambia versus Tanzania on this?
Yeah. So, okay. So one of the interesting things that the premature deindustrialization argument points out is that you can have increases in industrial output as well, but these don't. Increases in industrial employment don't follow from that. So one of the core things that's being argued there is basically that when you do have industries relocate, so there have been industries that have successfully been relocating to East Africa, for example. And Ethiopia would again be a really good example of this. And Ethiopia is one of the case studies in premature deindustrialization for this reason. So when you have industries that relocate, right, they're still competing on the global market. And that competition on the global market is basically inducing them to use the global standard in technology for most industrial sectors, right? Because your savings on cheap labor aren't enough to offset the need to use whatever the machines that prevail in that industry are. So you're still using those kind of industrial standard forms of machinery. And that capital intensive side is really, if you want to find like a single causal effect, right, it's in that technical change over the long term. So now that these industries are all fairly capital intensive, then when you transfer them, even when you successfully attract them to your business park in Dar es Salaam or wherever, you then have this problem of they don't actually employ that many people. Right? Like you don't have to have that many workers for modern factories. Look at the types, just the amount of employees that you used to have in steel factories in Gary, Indiana, back in the day, right? And compare that to the amount of workers that you need, even in like a shoddy, low-end steel foundry in India, right? It's way less. It's just way less. Like it's just a much, much more capital intensive sector now. And there's no reason to do it any other way. If you are being disciplined by global market forces, you also can't, right? Because your steel is just going to cost too much. It will not be sellable on the market. So that is one of the really like core differences, right? So we're not in this era where if you do attract the industries, they bring employment with them necessarily. So that's the big difference. In terms of relating to critical development and underdevelopment, like these older kind of theories, those theories have a bunch of other issues, right? And they actually are very broad. So a lot of times when people talk about things like underdevelopment theorists or like dependency theory, right? So dependency theory is this super broad thing that includes vaguely Marxian strands, but is really dominated by these liberal theorists from Latin America, like the Latin American structuralists. And the liberal theorists are making this very, very classical, like political economy style argument about what uneven exchange is, and basically that they're kind of theorizing that a lot of this is happening at like the level of kind of circulation, and that there's these inequities built into circulation, and that makes it so that like the terms of trade for poor countries are bad for those reasons, and you need to do all these things. It's not necessarily that isn't true, but that's really not the cause of those things, right? The Marxist dependency theorists got a little bit closer, but they often had these other weird ideas that totally kind of scuttled the core of their theory. So a lot of the Marxist dependency theorists, for example, were drawing from these very strong forms like the monopoly capitalism argument, which was arguing that like competition was not functional at the highest levels of the global market, that there were these monopoly prices that were just set by these giant conglomerates. And they were literally saying basically like classical forms of capitalism no longer are functioning, right? And if you look at the predictions at the end of like the books that are like these classical ones, I think Paul Baran makes one, and Samir Amin has this kind of list of predictions at the end. They're all fucking wrong, like for what happens in the next 40 years. Like they're so abjectly incorrect that that's why a lot of that theory fell out of favor, is because they all were predicting that the sort of things that happened in East Asia couldn't happen, right? So that was really what scuttled their theories within general kind of reception and turned people more to like world systems theory, which had this more like wave-like model of development. It was essentially, again, just a return to this Smithian conception of how it worked. And I think that there's immense problems with world systems theory as well, in the sense that what happened when the dependency theory stuff got fell out of favor was that a lot of the value theory that went into it also fell out of favor. And there's a few theorists, Marini, the Brazilian guy Marini, he's like one of the only ones who has like a fairly rigorous value theory aspect to it that doesn't rely on this monopoly capitalism theory. So Samir Amin has a value theory aspect, but it relies on all these shoddy predictions from monopoly capitalism and all these weird things about like we've entered a new stage of development and Marx needs to be completed, and there's all this,
the period of Marxists where they all quit being Marxist.
Yeah, essentially, but that's a recurring theme.
Yeah, yes, it is.
Especially in American Marxism. The first American Marxists all got really obsessed with Veblen and American pragmatism, and they all abandoned Marxism. This includes the guy who basically like translated and published the first U.S. editions of Capital. Like all the first early American Marxists abandoned it because they got caught up with what was fashionable at the time, and they justified it as like, well, if historical conditions change, so does the theory, and therefore Dewey is really the guy. Dewey and Veblen are the guys who are theorizing it today. But it's this very it is a very common and recurrent thing, and it's especially common, I think, in American kind of Marxism, where the monopoly capitalism theory comes from. But like the Americans are just always getting caught up in what's fashionable, right? And then they end up giving up Marxism and reviving it. And there's a few. I always really love those quotes from like Bordiga and some of the more stalwart people who say like the people who are trying to update Marx are always the worst. Like they're just the worst. Like we hate the people who are like overly orthodox, et cetera, et cetera. We hate the people who are opportunists, but the people who try to update Marx, they're the worst.
Well, it is interesting to me that anyone maintained monopoly capital theory after the 1970s. Like that is wild to me. And you're right. One of the things that there are two things that I always had a issue with world systems theory. I mean, both its Marxist and non-Marxist form, is that they don't totally naturalize states, but ultimately they see states as the units of contestation. Actually, always. Every now and then Wallerstein will talk peripheries within the core and whatnot, but they never really develop a strong analytic for dealing with it. And the other problem is, like, they don't have a value theory, and I'm not even sure they have a theory of power either. So it's just kind of assumed. And so that kind of makes figuring out the mechanisms of exploitation kind of hard if you have no grounds for justifying what the exploitation is on.
Yeah. Oh, and it is all value theory problem because, value is fundamentally a structure of power, of social domination, right? And so without that, you're totally right. They can't explain the state. The state just exists. And then, because the state, for communists, the state is always an emanation of class power. And so you can't understand it without understanding class power. And then, of course, the class element of class power means that you have this relationship of exploitation that is expressed through the value form. And so this is the big problem with world systems theory. Not that they don't have good historical accounts or arguments. They have great data, really good, just like documentation of these long wave cycles, et cetera, et cetera. And Giovanni Arrighi is probably the best. He's probably the closest to like a Marxist value form, a Marxist theorist within world systems theory, but he also does not engage with the real question of value at all. This is a big part of the current book I'm working on, which is very, very long for this reason, but basically can be thought of as like what happens if we try to put value theory back into some of these world systems type schema. So if we look at some of the same things they're looking at, but with value in mind, and this character of value is social domination, and that also brings up like this question of state theory. What is the state, and why does it take these forms? Because the world systems theorists are essentially they make these caveats all the time, like you said, but they're essentially offering something that remains kind of methodologically nationalist, and they are looking at, they're basically offering like a more or less Smithian political economy and a Weberian understanding of like the nation state in combination over the long run. And they're not super critical of any of those categories, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that's interesting when I hear people talk about this today, that your work, most recent research, makes very clear that the dynamics of automation that we see in like reshoring in the United States, where I've been telling people for years, the idea that the US is a non-productive economy is not true. It's just not true. I don't know where people get this from. It's just that production doesn't require that many people anymore. You've got socially necessary labor down to almost nothing. Which also means profit rates are going to be weird and kind of low. And, and then you built on that all these bureaucratic systems where we're moving money around in a highly inefficient way. But what a lot of people don't seem to look at is that's also true in the developing world. Like that this is also not employing that many people there. Like this idea that in Africa there's teeming industrial masses just isn't true. In fact, it's not even as true as one would think in China, which is what you said. And that should change a lot of the way people talk about the global situation. That is a problem for Marxists. It's one that I ironically think we've kind of known about and been in denial about since the beginning of the 20th century, when Bernstein first had the first revisionist crisis. Because what triggered that is like realizing that Germany was never going to reach a majority of the population being industrial proletariat. But that's only gotten more extreme in the last 120, 130 years.
Absolutely. And I think that the revisionist debate is very interesting because it's also like the Leninist response in many ways is still kind of correct, because the whole Leninist response to that was just like, well, fuck it. It doesn't matter, right? Like, you don't need this big industrial majority. We could just kind of go for it. But I think the interesting thing now, the thing that's different from this Leninist case, is that all of the really existing Leninist kind of Communist Party models, they de facto relied on large peasant populations. And this became really the apex of this became like the peasant army kind of model through the Chinese Revolution and then the subsequent kind of third world stuff that would later become what we know of as Maoism today. At the time was not called that or anything. But these were all based on still having a fairly strong subsistence peasantry. And there's a few places in the world where something of this model has been able to survive, like in the Philippines and whatnot. But even those places, you're seeing it really like go through this kind of harrowing because of the fact that you don't have this subsistence base for the peasantry anymore. So even basic things like supporting your like guerrilla bases in the mountains actually becomes materially very difficult when you don't have a basis of subsistence in those areas. So this is the real question: is how do you respond to that same conundrum that like the early kind of revisionist debates were about, but without having this alternate kind of base outside, out in the countryside, essentially. And that's the real political kind of conundrum that we're in right now: is how do we formulate things, political interventions that can work without needing some sort of industrial kind of majority, but also without having this exterior to the system, right, that can be kind of retreated to in the classical kind of peasant or even old utopian kind of fashion. That's the real political core of the problem. And
well, I mean, for me, that's a fascinating problem today. I mean, if you look at the developed world, on one hand, proletarian relations, and that we mean the wage relation, is not universalized, but it's as close as you're gonna get. Like, huge portions of the population, somewhere between, depending on how you count it, like 70 and 80%. On the other hand, that's not an industrial proletariat that's skilled to work together, and increasingly that doesn't even always need basic literacy, and like there's all these, like there's a de-skilling in the developed world that I don't think people like in the Second International could have even foresaw. Like it wouldn't even have registered them as a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
But that's also paired into the developing world by a lot of people through this premature deindustrialization also never being skilled. So that does kind of lend, that leads to a pretty significant problem. I mean, you're right. Yeah, there's parts of India and the Philippines where you can maybe still do a mass line model, but I don't even think there's a whole country you could probably do that in. I have no idea how you'd use that to launch anything globally either. It's kind of depressing. What do you see as, if any? I mean, like, look, I'm not one of these people who says there always has to be hope, but what do you see, if any? Are there any countervailing trends and tendencies that we can look at that would give us maybe hints at what we need to do to organize this?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. One thing, as you sort of point out, is this whole social democratic and Second International kind of arc was doomed from the start. But it's like fundamental presumptions were really troubled by these trends, where there was never going to be this massive increase in the industrial working class in that kind of classical sense. So a lot of those strategies, right, are never going to work for various reasons, but like that's a really big one because they're so premised on this idea of having this strong working class culture based in kind of factory labor. At the same time, we have a bunch of examples that are more similar to our era. Again, the big difference is kind of the peasant role. But if you look at like before the Second International, if you look at like earlier kind of workers movement stuff in like the 19th century, like the formation of that early workers movement, they really, it wasn't drawing from this mass factory labor population. It was something a lot more similar to today. It was a lot of people involved in like these weird mishmash of handicrafts, shitty forms of service work, like all kinds of weird service work at the time, and people who are like new migrants to the cities, and all of these things that we kind of see today. A ton of like dock workers, logistics workers in general. That was a huge portion, and huge center of early industrial organizing efforts were all like these logistics kind of workers. So I think in many respects, we've reverted to conditions that are in many ways more similar to the real classic kind of a workers' movement period of like, the middle of the 19th century, the later kind of 19th century, before this particular second international strategy kind of emerged from it, with these kind of big mass manufacturing centers with tons, tens of thousands of workers employed in Indiana, or in Germany. The big difference, like I said, is the kind of peasantry difference. It doesn't mean that you can't use subsistence as sort of a retreat or kind of sanctuary sort of model. I think that if it's one of the things where you never want to say like, well, you can't have some sort of revolutionary struggle here because the material conditions are just too bad, right? Maybe that's somewhat true in some places, but really I think that you could have these insurrectionary struggles that are maybe even successful in many places, but then they get forced into basically this question of is how do we survive after that, because they don't have a way to kind of spread. And so we do see this in these peripheral, like far hinterland locations. We see this with like the Zapatistas. We see this with the Kurds. We see this with even the Nepali Maoists would be kind of in this category. And many of them face the same problems, despite having very different, ostensibly different like political theories and strategies and stuff. They basically get put into the same position of like, okay, we have these liberated territories. We sort of have to engage with the global market in some fashion, but we try to build up some sort of subsistence basis. And then, it's this kind of open question. But I think it's something that's really not solved, and it's not like a strategy to advocate to people. It's sort of like a survival mechanism. It's not like a winning strategy. It's just a surviving strategy. That said, there's a bunch of things going back to this idea of like, there's these ways that employment and stuff does kind of mirror these earlier, like early industrial kind of models, and even some of the things that like, yeah, we don't have a peasantry, but if you look at the way that like the atomization of employment and the population stuff, in many ways, organizing today is similar to organizing among peasant populations for that reason. You have like massive kind of like de-skilling, right? You don't have a lot of industrial skills. You have people who are like widely distributed in terms of where they live and are very like socially kind of like atomized outside of their immediate kind of scene. You don't have some of the really good amenities for earlier peasant organizing of like communal structures and things like that.
Way
but
more
some similarities.
Way more peasants in France than peasants in Russia. Like,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean that it does strike me that, all the rage these days is talks about multipolarity, which I'm not going to go into that, but as a framework that's just describing hegemonic power
Mm-hmm.
bases, and one of the things that I've talked about, I kind of view the geopolitical world right now as like the 19th century with Cold War characteristics, meaning that nuclear weapons mean that we don't just directly fight each other, but we're still competing for resources, great game style. And it feels like also we're dealing with a bunch of hybrid class people effectively, even if they are kind of dependent on the wage fund somehow, but are alienated, socially isolated, not used to communal labor, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And I've even gone into this with thinking about like trucker strikes and whatnot, because truckers are a mixture of petit bourgeois and workers, right? But everyone's like, oh, well, why are they always so reactionary? I'm like, well, just think about the nature of their job. They're alienated all the time, Like, I hate to be like that obvious, but it is in some ways that obvious. They're one person in a car by themselves. Like, there's some coordination needed, but not a lot. And uh, a lot of times things that like, during COVID or during the 70s, with the gasoline shortages, etc., and the change in the speed limit, what they're responding to is their immediate needs as individual workers that kind of have a semi petit bourgeois function even when they're laborers. That's a lot of us now. I mean, and it seems to me that, I didn't bring you on necessarily critique where the left is headed, but it seems to me that the left right now is positing this massive industrial working class that just doesn't exist. Like, and they're positing it off of, like, I guess history or aesthetics or something. Like, and when they realize it doesn't exist in the first world, they start looking for it in the quote third world. I'm gonna get into three world theory, but also it's not really there either. So,
Yeah. Well, and there's this question though, I think also of like,
mhm.
I don't personally think it ever really existed. Like, I think that there were certain moments where in certain countries it looked like it might be about to. There were strategies that formed of it, but like even if we look at like let's look at the classical period of like the height of mass manufacturing employment from like the 30s to the 50s. What were a lot of the struggles that were going on? Right? Because capitalism is a global system, and it's always global. Right. So we have to talk about the entire thing. We can't just look at the US and say what kind of struggles were there in the US. Even then, though, I think we could find plenty that didn't have that character. But look at these global struggles. What was going on? Well, there was massive uprisings in the colonial world in many of these periods. We had like the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. You had massive strikes in the colonial world that were led by logistics workers, again, like porters, people who were basically like the equivalent, like longshoremen, dock workers, that sort of thing, and by people who in reproductive sectors, in the civil service, teachers, government workers, et cetera, et cetera. Those were massive, massive industrial actions in that same period. That same period also sees the most massive kind of peasant-based civil war in recent history in China, and then similar things in Vietnam, in Korea, in various other kind of locations had forms like that. Right? These were all occurring at the same time that the supposedly classical workers' movement of mass manufacturing also kind of existed. And then if you look at even within those core manufacturing kind of countries, you actually had an immense amount of organizing that was kind of like outside of that focused on things like unemployment and like the depression, right? So you had these massive organizations of the unemployed that had more characteristics that are similar to like tenants' rights struggles today and stuff were also, very, very large at that time, probably larger, honestly, than they are today. And then you had all the other kind of things that are more familiar to today, like riots against police, killing people based on race and class, and all of these things in all these different countries. All of those things, right, were already there. So in many ways, what this kind of leftist image of the workers' movement is itself a kind of historical myth. I think that Mario Tronti is very interesting in the way that he also talks about this kind of fact, because he's talking about a period where there is this mass manufacturing kind of period, right? But he also points out that like the workers' movement itself, right, is the ideology of capital. It is this bourgeois ideology that's kind of imposed on top of this working class antagonism, this kind of proletarian revolutionary subjectivity that's potentially there. The workers' movement in this classic kind of example is the way that gets sort of domesticated, reincorporated into what Tronti calls like the plan of capital. Right? It's just a necessary part. This image is constantly reproduced by the operation of capital itself, because that operation actually does require the participation of like large kind of labor unions and the development of these social institutions to keep like the population alive and things like that, right? So these are just ideological elements of capital's kind of image of the world. And our whole idea, this leftist idea of the workers' movement, mass industrial kind of labor, that's really where that originates. If you look at the actual kind of history of revolutionary communist thought, right, it's always been about breaking that image. And it's framed this in different ways historically. Like the classical Leninist one was opposing it to, you know, trade union consciousness or economism, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at like Marx and Marx's engagement with like the British trade unionists, he's making similar arguments against the Ricardian socialists. He's making similar arguments against the Lassalleans. He's making similar arguments. And you see this kind of repeated again and again in different eras. So I think we're always dealing with this problem of breaking through this myth. And what you identify as kind of like this leftist myth, it's really part of kind of the ideological administration of capitalist society. So it's always going to be there. How much we buy into it maybe does measure the extent of like, you know, weakness of the left or whatever. And because it's been dominant for a long time. It's not just like this classical workers' movement thing. We can also think of it as like movements in general, right? The idea that change comes from like social movements, from civil society, et cetera, et cetera. Like these are ideological kind of images of how politics works from this kind of bourgeois perspective, from this capitalist perspective. And part of the whole idea of communist theory, right, is breaking through those kind of ideological, appearances, seeing where they come from, that also formulating sort of a coherent revolutionary kind of thrust beneath that. And that does have to deal with these more concrete questions that you kind of bring up. And we can talk. There's some interesting things in like the Chinese case about how do we understand these de-skilling kind of things that happen, the process of like reindustrialization, quote unquote reindustrialization in the US. It's not really reindustrialization, although it is regionally reindustrializing certain areas. But then again, not a lot of employment. So I have a bunch of examples from this, but just kind of depends where you'd like to go.
Well, let's talk about the Chinese case, and then let's go to America, because those are the two big poles right now. Screw Europe, we don't care about them. And I'm kidding, European listeners. I know I have some. So what do we see going on in China with de-skilling, reskilling, etc.?
Yeah. Well, I do. So first, I will say, just to give a little tidbit to the Europeans, I will say that there is historically a pattern of like a lot of revolutionary situations kind of arising in the most kind of backwater and backwards parts of the world. So it wouldn't be surprising if we saw one arise in France or somewhere today, right? So in terms of like you're right, this kind of real core of the global economy, we're really talking about China. There's a very, very interesting discursive thing that's been happening in China in the past 10, 15 years. There's been a lot of concern about deindustrialization, basically. And so this has been expressed in official outlets by the party. And also, so what I'm going to say sounds fake, but it's not fake. There's kind of this equivalent of like Reddit in China. There's kind of like blogging, micro-blogging kind of culture, and these sort of like forums that have people who are like kind of known figures in these forums. And there's very, very good evidence that a lot of like high level thinkers and even like party strategists and statesmen, right, actually read these forums and potentially also are the ones posting on these forums kind of anonymously. And then there's a lot of people who are posting on the forums whose programs essentially get then duplicated in like official state documents later. And there's an open question to like, what is that level of, like, is it just people are kind of reading this stuff and being influenced as part of like the zeitgeist, right? Or is this someone who works for the government? Or is this something where like this white paper was actually modeled on this weird paper that this person posted on this forum? Anyway, so there's this very vibrant kind of like internet culture in China is the point. But that internet culture also has this very clear influence on policymaking. It's clear that it happens, but it's opaque exactly what the mechanisms are. Now, that said, there's a a lot of concern, both in these official outlets, that to the extent that we kind of have they're visible to us, and in these kind of like online forums and stuff, about deindustrialization, about the effects on China of deindustrialization and the effects on the population of deindustrialization. There's two really big examples I'll talk about. One is Wang Huning. He's a member of the Central Committee and very high level kind of thing. Before that, he was just an academic, and he wrote these books, basically. Let me see if I can find the title. Oh yeah, so so Wang Huning wrote America Against America is the big one that people kind of cite. It's based on his trip to the United States in like the 90s, I think. And so just for context, Wang Huning is like he's the chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. He's one of the kind of top leaders on the Politburo, et cetera, et cetera. So this is like a major figure. But when he was an academic, he wrote this book. Once you're a major figure in China, you don't get it published anymore. So we don't get like official outlets. Everything gets condensed into what's officially like Xi Jinping thought and everything like that. But you see elements of his thought very clearly go into this. So he writes his book based on his trip in America. And it's a fascinating book, absolutely fascinating. There isn't an official English translation. There's some shitty English translations out there, but like there's an official one. But he like goes around all these cities in the US and he's like, oh yeah, this park in San Francisco is full of homeless people. And then he goes around and he goes to like, I don't know, somewhere in like Chicago or Detroit or somewhere. And he's talking to some other Chinese guy who's telling him like, oh yeah, you shouldn't go to these parts of the city because they're very dangerous. And, so he gets like the idea of like a racial ghetto explained to him. And so he's kind of documenting all of these things. And he's like, look at all of these like kind of horrible forms of like social anomie in the US in like the 1990s, right? Look at all these horrible forms of like social collapse, et cetera, et cetera. And he's tracing all of these things to this phenomenon of deindustrialization, financialization, et cetera, et cetera. And his whole kind of strategy is like, how does China like avoid these problems as it kind of develops is one of the open kind of questions. Now, the other side of this gets much more explicit in recent years on these kind of internet forums. There's this kind of like sort of new right-wing faction within Chinese politics, colloquially called the Gongyedang, the Industrial Party. There's people translate it some other kind of ways. There's sort of like this weird combination of like Promethean pro-technology people, but they're also very, very focused on this question of deindustrialization and the negative social effects of deindustrialization within China. And so they're really saying these Gongyedang, these industrial party people on the internet are basically saying like, look, China is going to lose its capacity to be to compete in like advanced industrial lines, right? But B, like it's going to create all these negative social effects if we deindustrialize. So we have to figure out ways to increase industrial employment. We have to find ways to give people good like engineering education. A lot of these guys are engineers, and they say that they're engineers, like working engineers in industrial districts in like southern China. And so they're making these kind of interesting arguments about ultimately what it becomes is this like technophilic like technocracy, where they say like, look, we need engineers in charge, and that then they can distribute more like industrial knowledge and lead into new kind of sectors, et cetera, et cetera. And in many ways, the structure of the Chinese state is like this. All the major leaders in China are engineers, except for one. I think Li Keqiang was not an engineer. He was an economist. So there's all engineers and like one economist is kind of the idea. But everyone has an engineering degree, right? So it is very much this kind of technocratic thing. Now, the point is that there's two new kinds of like utopianism that get generated at the popular level by this phenomenon that you're talking about of like deindustrialization and its effects on consciousness, like basically the decline in productive subjectivity and its effects on political subjectivity is sort of how we talk about it. One of the things is this utopianism that Nick Chavez and I talk about in the article we wrote for EndNotes about like this sort of fantasy localism, right? Where people kind of imagine, they don't have a good understanding of production, and therefore they sort of imagine that people can return to like subsistence economies, essentially these local autarkies. But they never are able to really theorize exactly how that works, but there's like this striving for it. You see this again and again and again. The Kohei Saito, the guy who's the Japanese Marxist, like Marxologist, who's now very popular for writing one of the big degrowth books. If you look at him actually talk about like political strategy, it's very naive and in fact entirely idiotic. Like it really does not make sense. But it's this fantastic sort of image of returning to this peasant kind of countryside life in Japan of all places, right? Which is hugely reliant on like massive imports of petroleum for like producing energy, and imports of uranium for producing nuclear energy, and like all of this stuff. Like it just it really doesn't make sense. But this is one of the types of utopianism. This, I think, is the utopianism that many of us are familiar with in like the American like left is kind of a default thing. But there's another one. The other one is the one that gets expressed in this hard eco-modernist kind of guys, or this technophile guys of these Gongyeadang, these industrial party people in China, which is this obsession with engineers as they currently exist, right? As if you just transferred political power to these people, then that would solve all these. Like they should really run society. That would solve all of these kind of issues, and that production itself is neutral, right? It's this neutral technical apparatus that can just be geared toward better ends. And so the socialistic example of that are like the People's Republic of Walmart and Amazon type arguments, where the kind of people just argue, well, we could, if we just nationalize these things, we could just use them for good, right? But they don't get into these more intricate, they're doing the same thing of not getting into these more intricate questions of like the social design of those apparatuses. Like what are they really designed for? Because in large part, they're just designed for domination, exploitation of like the workforce, right? And it's not to say that you can't repurpose technologies. You obviously can. That's the whole point. But they actually don't talk about repurposing. They talk about just using it as it exists, unrepurposed for some different ends, right? Not redesigning it. And so this is another kind of side of this utopian kind of scheme that comes from the degeneration of political subjectivity, of productive subjectivity. And then it has this effect on political subjectivity. And so this, I think, is really, really important to keep in mind, is we have these two mutual kind of errors, utopian schemes that come from that process. One is this naive localism, and the other one is this kind of like naive technophilia, put the engineers in charge, technocratic kind of thing. And that applies not just to like actual engineers, but also this idea of like, well, if we just had really smart social scientists, political economists, right, in charge of the central bank, then we could make it a central bank for the people, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, in the aughts, that would have been David Graeber versus John Searson, and today that's Lee Phillips versus Kohei Saito. Maybe I shouldn't name names, but I'm going to. So I know these people. I can get away with it. I mean, it is a real interesting problem, because it does feel like you're forever in a bind. I've done a series on the eco-socialist answers, and I've been very unsatisfied with both the industrial bright greeners and now they're degrowth, but I used to call them deep greeners, but I guess that actually does have a different metaphysics or something attached to it. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me like a problem that I've seen before, stated over and over again, between not even just in Marxism, like we've seen it with left anarchists too, and it just seems to come back reframed. And it seems to me that that's kind of about not wanting to deal with the realities of both the population scale and production, and how and the under capital efficient production is actually kind of bad.
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, they're both utopian in this classic sense of not really wanting to think through how you get from A to B, and also not wanting to address the fact of domination built into these systems. Like, it's just different ways of rejecting actually thinking through both of those. And then they're also both utopian in the sense of just being the elaboration of ideals, right? They're nice ideals. Maybe they're abstractly correct, right? In their own ways, right? And probably the degrowth people are closer. Like, morally, they're probably more right in some sort of philosophical sense, right? But philosophy doesn't really matter in and of itself, right? Like, it is important, but the whole point of communist theory is that it's not enough, right? That politics doesn't emerge from nice philosophical ideas. The classic critique of like the utopian socialists is this idea of politics emerging from Enlightenment ideals, right? But it doesn't. It's this bloody, struggle through the mud against, this other force that wants to put you in your place, right? And so that's why these elements, they're always proven so absurd when actual political outbursts happen, because they don't have anything to offer. Like, when you have massive riots that see the downtown cores of every American city looted, in the space of like a weekend, neither of these political factions have anything to say about that. Like, they can't, there's just nothing. They have no level of political engagement possible with any kind of activity going on in the proletarian class. And at worst, they then see these forms of activity as just naive and stupid and just like, well, I guess isn't good enough, basically, because of course it isn't good enough. It's just like this amorphous, kind of nihilistic, very immediate kind of uprising, and that's always going to happen, right? And the whole point of political organization is that you engage with those things and you build some sort of interface, right, which we traditionally
channel
call
it
party.
somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, and you also learn from it, right? You learn where you are, because those events are extremely important in terms of illustrating the actual character of political subjectivity right now. Like, where is it being expressed? How is it being expressed? What is it divorced from? What does it target? And why does it target these sort of things? We talked about like what are some hopeful kind of elements of it. I think there are actually a few very, very hopeful elements that are kind of built into these trends. It's not just about the degeneration of productive subjectivity, like that is there, but at the same time, you also see this massive awareness of questions of social reproduction that weren't nearly as obvious before, because so many more people now work in social reproductive sectors, right? People are working as nurses, people are working as teachers. Like, these are the big employment sectors in a lot of areas, right? And that raises these new political kind of questions. A lot of the ways I would actually counter both the eco-modernist and the degrowth sort of sides of the debate, right? The eco-modernist thing is just a classic example of like, well, we can unfetter the productive forces, right? And the degrowth people say, well, that's bad, et cetera, et cetera. And both are wrong, right? In their own kind of ways. But like I said, maybe the degrowth people are a little bit more like morally correct. But the big thing is, they're also kind of wrong in the sense that there will be an unfettering of productive forces in certain respects, right? It just doesn't look like the eco-modernist people will say it. Will say it. And in fact, one of the big things I think that would happen that is this immediate kind of objective of communist organizing is instead what you might think of as like the unfettering of the reproductive forces, right? We have this massive capacity to just care for people, right? And to develop people's potential, intellectual and physical, and their basic kind of like level of like health and things like that. There is this massive embedded potential and immense skill in how to do those things, right? And if that can also be integrated with productive knowledge and this skill in how to like produce the things that form the basis of being able to do all of that stuff, that's a huge, huge potential. And that's also historically what socialist attempts at socialist societies have actually been very good at doing, is like educating people, ensuring people have health care, ensuring that people have like access to like amenities for like physical health, massive physical culture kind of infrastructure, and good food, et cetera, et cetera. Like those sort of things, I think are really, we have a lot of embedded skill, a lot of amenities, and a lot of capacity to just do that immediately, right? Like that's not hard for people to envision. And that's why so much of just knee-jerk politics is like, why can't we have healthcare, right? Like, why can't we go to school for free? Like, those sort of things are really salient and obvious. And then the other thing that's very obvious is just the fact that a lot of these interventions, Joshua Clover and Jasper Burns and some other people have like talked about this. A lot of these interventions are just by default, they're targeting these circulatory systems because that's what's available and that's what's there. And you can extend that sort of logic to say, well, there is also actually really big organizing, classical organizing opportunity within like sectors like logistics. Like right now, I work at a big logistics facility at the port, right? It is a big, it's very, very deindustrialized in compared like historically in terms of how many people we employ, but it still does employ quite a few people. And there is a huge potential. Like if you had that sector or unionized and organized in a radical way, it was integrated with some sort of larger political kind of body and this larger political subjectivity that could, be an immense kind of tool in this revolutionary antagonism against the present world. So there are these little hopeful bits like that. In addition to that, the technical capacity is the other thing. I think people just forget that like the basic argument, the basic ethical argument or moral argument or political argument that communists are making is not actually about immiseration, about like the fact that it's not to say that immiseration doesn't exist. Like a lot of people exist in horrible, horrible living conditions, in abject poverty, in awful conditions, in prison camps, in places like Gaza. Like these things are produced by the capitalist system, and they've always been produced by the capitalist system, right? So those things I think are clear, but that's actually not the core of the communist argument, right? The core of the communist argument isn't about absolute immiseration. It's about relative capacity, right? It's about what kind of technical capacity, what social capacity do we actually have right now as a global society versus what we actually do with that capacity, right? Because we have the capacity to feed everyone in the world, no problem, right? Way more than they need, and we don't do it. We have way more than we need to give everyone free healthcare, everyone in the world, and we don't do it, and free education, and we don't do it, right? We have the capacity to electrify Africa, and we don't do it. And I'm totally against these primitivist kind of ideas of like, well, maybe we don't need industrial development in Africa. You absolutely fucking do. People need electricity. They're going to want electricity. If you can't give it to them, they're going to turn to capitalist means to develop it in a traditional kind of fashion. Like it has to, like those developmental kind of mechanisms, like don't go away. All that stuff becomes important. But in fact, you could just do it, right? It doesn't have to happen through this capitalist means. That is the fundamental kind of point of this communist ethical argument, is like the vast shortfall between what we're capable of and what we actually do. It's not about absolute immiseration, although that obviously is there, right? No one is arguing. You can't base your ethical argument for capitalism on the fact that it just immiserates everyone, because it doesn't. It also does produce development. It has these horrible ecological consequences, et cetera, et cetera. But like that's always a losing battle because you're always proven wrong, right? So this immiseration is part of it. It's a crucial thing to agitate against and to point out. But the real sin of that immiseration is not that it's absolute immiseration, it's that it's so far short of what we're capable of, right? And so that's, I think, also where we see a lot of hope, is that we're capable of a lot technically. Like we can produce mind-boggling amounts of things. If we wanted to as a society, if we just organized social resources in a fashion that was like equitable and reasonable, you could introduce you could electrify basically all of sub-Saharan Africa. You could introduce universal healthcare to everywhere in the world. You could do all of this within the space of like a decade, easy. If you had those social resources deployed in these particular ways that prioritize these sort of things. And at the same time, you could lead a massive agroecological rehabilitation of present like industrial society, which is also a crucial aspect of like what a communist program needs to advocate for, and is really central to the social metabolic idea of what communism is, right? Is rehabilitating this metabolic relationship through more healthy, environmentally healthy agroecological systems of production, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the latter takes a little bit longer than the former, but
Yes, yeah, that's true.
but both are. But that I remember just sitting and listening to. I've had Matt Huber on, I've had John Benjamin Foster on, I've had Jason uh, Smith on, a bunch of people on the Eco Socialist talk about this lately, and I've just been sitting here thinking like, it is a massive unleashing of reproductive forces, but like once,
Yeah.
like, not that there isn't a cost to maintaining it and whatnot, but like every incentive in capital is to make everything shorter and shorter term because you got to keep the market moving, etc. That's why I don't have faith that anything sitting on my desk is going to last more than 10 years, whereas like stuff made in the 19th century is I have in my house. Um, but blah blah blah, declining rates of profits, blah blah. But in a socialist economy, we can make stuff to last, and we know how to do it. That's the thing. We actually do know how to do it. My fear is that eventually enough of the population won't know how to do it. Like that's my nightmare scenario. That's like the common ruin of all, is like deskilling gets so decadent that we don't know how to do it anymore.
Yeah, no, I think that's this is a fundamental fear of, like I talk about, like the Gongye-dang, the industrial party people in China. This is a big thing that comes up again and again in various kind of forms. You see it in like different sci-fi kind of scenarios and stuff. Liu Cixin has the Chinese sci-fi author. He has a short story that's basically this idea, like there's like an advanced human society. They originally seeded life on Earth and they return to Earth at this hyper advanced stage, but they're all like basically children because they don't know how to operate their own technology and it just takes care of them. And so then Earth has to, like, it's also this weird Chinese story about filial piety. They are obligated to take care of their parent species, right? Because of filial piety, but they're just like fucking children. They don't know how to do anything for themselves, right? So I think this is a fear that really gets expressed in many ways. Now, there's a couple things that I think push against it. One thing is that even within capitalist development, you're going to have new lines of production. And whenever you have a new line of production, yes, it often automates faster, but initially it actually often requires quite a bit of human labor and quite a wider distribution of engineering knowledge about how to do it. So if you look at like electronics, this is a classic example, because electronics in the modern form that we understand them of, like microelectronics, right? That sector didn't really exist before. Like no one was making microchips, right? And so now you have this whole sector of basically making microchips and plugging them into things and soldering circuit boards and whatnot and creating the casings that go on top of them, right? And when that started, that was very labor intensive because no one had done it before. So you just needed a bunch of people to do it by hand. And then it got rapidly mechanized, right? But it was a new sector. And so then it required, some elements of this. So there's certain things where we can expect that, like, that's also going to happen. In fact, AI is a really good example of that. People think of AI as like this massive kind of automating sector, and that's true, except it also has been required this massive input of human labor doing basically the equivalent of assembly work, where you just are correcting AI models. You're saying, you have people saying, no, this prompt is wrong, or this prompt is racist, don't use it, like those sort of things. And then you have all these background workers in the AI economy in the global South, especially, who are doing like just weird, ugly, like bug work or like content supervision and stuff like that. And it's actually a huge employment sector right now. And that itself will get mechanized and will get slimmed very rapidly, but it's a good example of this kind of phenomenon. So in one sense, you do have some sort of generalization of knowledge about some new kind of things, because this has driven, a bunch of new people have had to learn like how you operate AI models, and just they basically just have to learn Bayesian statistics and some coding, right? But like that's the idea, is that you have to get these things kind of operational. And so whenever you have new systems, you do have this surge in the need for these sort of skills. Now, at the same time, your fundamental point is totally right, though, is that this atrophies, right, unless you do something to stop it. And that is, in my opinion, I talk about this. I think I talk about this a little bit in the piece that I co-authored with Nick Chavez. This is actually a fundamental part of that early period that we call like a period of communist construction, which kind of covers this transitional stage where you can't really say you have like a communist society, right? But you're working towards it, and there's this intentional political drive to decommodify life, right? To eliminate money, to do all of these core communist things, provide all of these services for free, et cetera, et cetera. And part of that, maybe the central part of it, is rehabilitation of productive subjectivity. And that means distributing giving people much wider access to things like basic engineering knowledge, all of that, right? Like these are things that have massive artificial scarcity imposed on them in capitalist society. If you just think about American universities, right, the coding departments or the engineering departments of major American universities, right, it's incredibly difficult to get into them because of this artificial scarcity, right? They only hire so many professors, they only let in so many students. Even if you get into the college, you can't necessarily get into that program, et cetera, et cetera. But it doesn't mean that you couldn't create the capacity to more widely educate people. And so that's one of the core things. The other core thing is rehabilitating even more basic skills, like agroecological skills in people. And in that sense, we're not distributing like what you and I would think of as like engineering knowledge, but it basically is, right? It's this scientific knowledge at this broader sense. So it's this broader distribution of scientific knowledge, which requires the facilitation of like rehabilitating basic agroecological practices. So, for example, the big example in like much of like North America, and especially here in the Northwest, is like having traditional like indigenous controlled burn practices, right? Like having people who know how to do that, educating other people of how to do that and where and why, spreading those traditional indigenous practices of ecological management, right? Those things become absolutely essential as well. So, and that's part of this scientific kind of project. I sort of joke that, like, this is the sense in which I believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? When I tell people what the dictatorship of the proletariat kind of looks like, I say, well, just like imagine a giant, like everything is a giant community college, but we're all also armed.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I like about Maoism, and there's not a lot that I love about Maoism, but it is that period of the peasantry in the countryside where you're like teaching people malicious skills, basic literacy, the classics, how to plant shit, like how to do crop rotations, and everybody learns a little bit of everything, which I have Joseph Tainter disease. One of my fears about capitalist specialization is like we're all way too specialized in our skill sets.
Mm-hmm.
And a communist society, since we want, not that we're ever get rid of all division of labor, I'm not that idealistic, but like that we want division of labor to be somewhat voluntary. You have to have a bunch of different skill sets, right?
Yeah, or you have to have the ability to access them or to get them is the other important thing. Like, you don't have to always have them, but you have to be able to get them if you wanted to, right? Which we can't do. Like, if I wanted to go get these skill sets, like I literally probably couldn't afford it right now, and no one's going to give me like, I don't know, like another student loan to go and do this other, thing, et cetera, et cetera. And then could I even get into the program? Probably not, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. So, basically, I mean, universities are basically glorified Pareto machines, but like, communists really do have to deal with de-oligarchization. And that's something we really need to push. It's one thing I did like about your work with Nick and EndNotes, because it's something I drone on and on about, as because one, I'm talk about social reproduction work, I'm an educator, and two, I have just watched people get de-skilled. Like it's I see it in real time. And this, I think, as communists, is what we got to offer. We could, we can handle the problems that exist at a basic, like, no, we're not going to make an like gay luxury space communism or whatever, but we can handle the problems that exist right now for most of the planet, even at current population sizes, pretty readily if we really wanted to.
Yeah.
And we could give people a lot more empowerment over what they do with their life and time. Not that there wouldn't be labor. There's still lots of labor, but like you'd have a lot more control over it. You wouldn't be laboring for shit you don't need to. And I think, yeah, and I'm also with you. Everybody needs to be armed. When someone was like, well, what will you replace the police with? And I'm like, universal public militia. I don't know what else you want. None of us are cops if we're all cops, right? But which I think that scares people. But nonetheless,
yeah, I wouldn't do that branding, but
but anyway, thank you so much. I want to get you and Nick back on sometime to talk more specifically about that article you guys wrote for EndNotes. So I'll be in touch. Where can people find your work? I am going to link the two papers. Well, an interview and a paper we discussed indirectly in this will be linked in the show notes. But where else can people find your work?
The most kind of the readiest place people can find a concentration of my work is going to be on the if you look at the Brooklyn Rail magazine, the field notes section. I write most regularly for them. I have the book Hinterland is out through the Field Notes book series, which is on Reaction Press, based in the UK. I will have another book coming out through the Historical Materialism series in, I don't know, probably 2025, maybe 2026. So next year or the year after, it probably will move a little slow. It's just a very, very large book. So those are the places where people can go. I will also provide, because of the content of this talk, I'll give you the link to my dissertation if people are interested, and you can provide that. It's just kind of a long document, but I made it all public on like a Google Drive. Has the public version, and people can look at that if they're interested. It has a bunch of the data about all of this stuff that I sort of talked about, and especially a bunch of data about other things that we didn't get a chance to talk about, like the kind of underwhelming actual reality of like Chinese investment in overseas, especially in Africa, and some things like that. So it's kind of all over the place. I don't have a single website, but those are the places I would suggest looking. Brooklyn Rail, and then these various links that you'll send out.
All right, I'll put them in the show notes. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.